Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on Frugal technologies and innovations. Before we start, we are very happy to partner with Tata Teleservices for conducting this particular seminar session. We have a short video on to start with on the products as well as the company, which will be played now.
Well, there's no audio, is there?
Thank you. I request Pradeep Palari, our charter member, to welcome and introduce the speaker. Over to you, Pradeep.
All right. Good evening to you all. Myself, Pradeep Palasi, member of TiE Kerala. On behalf of TiE Kerala, it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this virtual session on frugal innovation. In the current economic and business scenario, the topic has lots of relevance for all businesses across the world. As you know, we are in a situation of low revenues, zero profitability for most businesses, and the business atmosphere is generally low, very low available investment for new things, and an ability for companies to bootstrap is also very limited because of the cash flow issues and lack of revenues. So, well, it is also a time of a lot of opportunities. The business models are changing, a lot of disruption. So it is creating a lot of new opportunities. So being innovative with your products, services, your business model, all of that puts you ahead of the game. Our speaker today is Mr. Joseph Walasha, founder and CEO of Ignito Technologies, who is a pioneer in the use of frugal innovation methodology, that is the ability to do more with less, developed in collaboration with a world-renowned thought leader from the University of Cambridge. Ignito is headquartered in the US, and it has offices in the UK and here in Cochin to service clients. Joseph is also the co-founder and managing partner of Nuvia Ventures, a disruptive new model to build standalone software companies. Joseph brings a track record of 2 decades of fast-paced business growth in IT service sector in US, Europe, and the Middle East. Prior to Ignito, he was with Mindtree for more than a decade and was instrumental in the growth of business in EU and US through many large contracts. Besides that, he also kickstarted Mindtree's Middle East business. He's also an early advocate of IT product startups and a vendor at Startup Village in Kochi, India. So that's a brief introduction on Joseph. He is going to take about 30 minutes to take us through his presentation. You can post your questions in the chat, and then we will take a few questions at the end of the session before concluding. With that, let me present to you, Mr. Joseph.
Thank you, Pradeep. Thank you. So, Nirmal, if I can have the presentation up, so then I think we can get started. Thanks, Nirmal. So, like Pradeep said, the topic is frugal innovation, and the topic we are going to cover specifically is how do we really bring frugal innovation into enterprise and the use of technology with it, right? The way we typically make this presentation is in two parts, right? So one is, as Pradeep said, the whole concept of frugal innovation or the frugal innovation methodology is something, this professor at Cambridge University, along with another well-known senior person, has created or researched over a decade and created this methodology. So we then collaborated with him to create a version that we could take to enterprise, especially around using technology to help enterprises with innovation in a frugal way, right? So that's a topic I want to cover. So let's get to the next slide, please. So before I start, I want to thank TiE for inviting us. It's always an honor to share our story, and with a eminent, well-known, group like TiE, I think it's an honor for us. So thanks again for inviting us. Moving on. So before we, get into the specifics around the presentation, I just want to take a moment to tell you a bit about what really is frugal innovation, right? Because I think a lot of people have heard about innovation, and people have also heard about frugal, right? So, and I did tell you saying that this book that you see on the screen was published by The Economist, a very well-known publication, right? And this was the book that was written by Cambridge University professor and one of his colleagues, Navi, right? So Jaideep and Navi were the two guys who wrote this. They studied, multiple social economic context, and then came up with this book. And one of the simple way they kind of qualified what frugal innovation meant was the art of overcoming harsh constraints by improvising and creating an effective solution with limited resources, right? So I think the key elements to remember as we go through this presentation is that first and foremost, the innovators who innovate in a frugal way are trying to overcome harsh constraints. When I say harsh, really harsh constraints, I'll cover some of that. The second is, improvising. It's not like, they invented something overnight, right? So they had these constraints and then they're trying to create a solution, and they're trying to build something over and over again. Because the third key thing to remember is that they also had really limited resources. So if you see, there are three things here. So one is first and foremost harsh constraints, and second is limited resources. And using these two, how over time they created, an effective solution by continuing to improvise, right? And an easy way to remember that is how to do more with less, right? Because if you see, more and less are opposites, right? So how do we really do more with less and more and better? I think that's the premise of the whole concept of frugal innovation, right? And the next few slides, moving on, you would see that these slides would typically be covered by either Jaideep or Navi, the folks who did all this research. And their research was not specific to the corporate world, but the research was more around, what are all the spaces in which they could do this. Sorry, Nirmal, I think the slide went up. Yeah, so can I have the next slide, please? So what they looked around was everything from, looking at, socioeconomic scenarios, looking at developing countries. So they looked at all possible scenarios. So it's not just, the corporate world. And what they felt was, net, if you kind of look at who can innovate frugally, these are very simple 5 things that came up. First and foremost, like I mentioned in the previous slide, how can you really do more with less, right? So the moment you're able to appreciate that, yes, just by having a lot of resources at hand or not having constraints will make it easier. So if you are able to adapt that mindset. Second is to keep it simple. Again, I'll show you some examples which will really drive home the point. The third thing is about, I spoke about improvising, right? So that ability to think and act flexibly. And the fourth thing is, when there is adversity, like, Pradeep mentioned, saying that current situation is where there are a lot of constraints all around us. There is a lot of adversity. Is there an way to kind of look at opportunity? And last but not the least, you are doing this not for the sake of, doing something or to make some, short-term cash, but then there is a real need that's around you. That's what you're looking at, right? And the way, the way I've structured the presentation is I'll cover 2 examples of, people who have been able to innovate frugally in a socio-economic environment. Then I'll talk about 2 examples of people who are doing frugal innovation in the corporate world. And then I'll talk about 2 or 3 examples in the context of what we are doing using technology to help enterprises to innovate frugally, right? Can I have the next slide, please? So this slide, if you see, there are 2 pictures. On one, on the left, you would see a picture of, a new age refrigerator, wherein, innovation is about trying to add a touch screen to interact with it, see what's inside the fridge, maybe remotely order some of your food, etc. Right? So that's one example. And on the right, you would see a gentleman called Mansukh Bhai, as he's called, wherein he's from a remote village in north of India, wherein, he had these harsh constraints that in the villages where he is, there is a lack of electricity, a lack of access to, fancy stuff like fridge, not much of battery technology, etc. Right? Now, this is a great example of someone. So Mansukh Bhai is a vegetable vendor, fruit vendor, and he goes around these multiple villages to kind of distribute all of that. And one of the issues many of his clients had was the ability to store this, right? Because, if you take a bunch of food for the day and give it, if the retailer is not able to sell everything, the next day it starts to get spoiled, right? So what Mansukh Bhai managed to create, because in his mind, there is a constraint, because if he doesn't figure out a solution, which is, an improvised solution for these clients of his, it is going to fundamentally affect his business, right? Second is, his clients don't have the wherewithal to kind of afford a fancy fridge or a battery technology and all of that, right? So what he created, which is called as a Mitti Cool, is he created this entire, what you're seeing there, similar to a fridge, but it's made of clay, right? And, it kind of keeps the, fruits fresh for about 2-3 days, right? So a way of looking at the entire concept of, refrigerating fruits without having access to electricity, a battery, and also access to a fancy, refrigeration technology, right? So a great example of, working within harsh constraints and limited resources to improvise and create something. So that's one example of how, somebody has done frugal innovation in a socio-economic environment. Moving on. So the next example is again India specific. I picked these because, this would be a lot more relevant and relatable for us. So again, this is the context with, farmers having not ready access to, the relevant data for cultivation, right? And so typically the way, many of us who are used to smartphones, we would think is that, okay, why don't we create a mobile app and then give access to them? But then, the reality is that there are a lot of farmers for whom even a basic mobile phone is still a luxury, right? So here is an example. So if you can go to the next slide. This farmers cooperative, what they did was they kind of came together to kind of create a capability to start to send SMSs in local languages to their farmer community, so that they were able to collect all this data, right? So it is still all the latest relevant information. It is circulated between multiple groups, but then again, instead of waiting for tech company or somebody to come and give them a solution, they just pulled their collective thinking together and said all of us or some of us have access to basic mobile phones, right? And how can we use that to kind of circulate between us all this information that's getting available, right? Which then had a fundamental difference on the livelihood and productivity of this group of farmers, right? So again, so two examples in a socioeconomic scenario on how frugal innovation was done, right? Moving on. Now I'll cover two innovations of examples of frugal innovation that has happened in a corporate environment, because that's, I think, a lot more relatable or closer to us. So, next slide. If you see in this, on the left again, you see a baby incubator, right? So this is typically when a child is born premature, right? So incubator is used to kind of keep the body temperature, and and with the use of that, survival of a premature baby is increased multifold, right? But then, as you can make out from the image itself, a device like this is a very expensive proposition, right? And only a very high-end hospital or someone can afford it, right? On the right is an example of frugal innovation, wherein a group of doctors and some of these material experts came together because they saw that especially in the developing world there was a high mortality rate of premature baby births, right? And because these kind of fancy devices were not affordable in these locations, right? They had to come up with a solution which was a lot more cost effective, not just something that would be like a little bit cheaper, but that was fundamentally a lot less expensive. And as they did their research, experimented with multiple options, what they realized was that the material that the astronauts used to go to space has the ability to kind of keep the body warm for days together, right? And so they created this sort of a baby wrap, which is about 30-40 times cheaper than the device on the left, right? So again, another great example of trying to solve the same problem at a much cheaper way. Of course, it doesn't have all the bells and whistles of the device on the left, but with that invention or innovation that the team was able to do, there was a huge improvement in the infant mortality rate with premature. So an example of how frugal innovation happened in a corporate context. Moving on to the next one. This is an example of, typically for children, when there are ear infections, they are always really scared going to doctors. And then if you need to get any fancy, inspection device, and especially for some of them when they have infection, you need to continue to keep, checking back to see how is the infection reducing, right? So a great example of, saying that this was, I think, initially done in the US in the West Coast, wherein instead of creating a standalone device, this company was able to create a small add-on to a mobile device. So using the camera of the mobile device itself, they were able to create a very cheap, ineffective thing coupled with a mobile app to able to do most of what a very fancy, expensive device would do. Again, another great example of fundamentally rethinking, saying that instead of creating the next fancy equipment to solve the problem, how can I create something that is very inexpensive, very accessible, and also which is child friendly to serve the purpose. innovations, right? So these are now two examples I have now shared of, in the corporate world, how they have adopted these frugal innovation principles and methodology to create something, right? So now I'll move on to some of the work we have done. So next slide, please. So from here on, it's very much the way typically when, Jaideep and I present. So this is from where, we come in to talk about how have we taken frugal innovation into the enterprise technology world. The previous slides, about what research they have done is typically what Jaideep or Navi would cover. But in this context, I'm covering both. So, but from here on, what we are going to talk about is more what did we do, having collaborated with this team to bring frugal innovation into the enterprise world of, and also using technology. So next slide, please. So what we first did was, so we had all these examples from the socio-economic world, developing countries, we then went and said, okay, so if we are going to take these concepts to the enterprise world of leaders who are working in the technology space, right? So typically in large companies, a CIO or the CIO organizations are the ones who look at innovation, look at new ideas, right? So we were able to kind of work with a cross-section of CIOs and CIO organizations to list down saying that in a corporate context, when there is a question around, are we innovating enough? Is the company still relevant? How do we accelerate our innovation, etc.? The list of points you see on the screen is what we were able to do. Again, none of this was, earth-shattering in this. Again, like the 4-5 principles of frugal innovation, the situations in the corporate world with innovation was very similar, which if you see, one of the things they told us was that, in the corporate world, there is no shortage of ideas. But then the real problem is how do you really kind of nurture these ideas, right? The second problem was, anybody who contributes ideas in a corporate world, they have a feeling that, I've created a great idea. But then how do you qualify that to and then create a business case, right? And many of them also told us saying that a lot of times, these guys would come back and when we get through to the qualifying process to see for a business case, then you suddenly realize saying that from having a lot of ideas, there are very few that you can really progress to a business case or nurture it, right? And a very important point that they told us also was, once you then create a business case, there is always very limited budget that's available because, it's always like there is a pool of ideas. Which ones do you invest in to create something, right? And many times if the idea is not in a core area, there is no designated budget available to, innovate in that, right? So this was the kind of feedback we got. And taking this feedback, working with, Jaideep and team, this is how then we started to progress into doing some. So now I'll talk about some examples because I think that's the best way to kind of illustrate what work we have done and what impact we were able to do. Can I have the next slide, please? So as I get into the examples, I just want to also share quickly what is our working model. So the way we approach it is we have Ignito as a services company. Ignito then works with corporates to kind of help them from ideating all the way to operating, right? So ideate, orchestrate, integrate, and operate is our model. And we work with corporates to help them start from the ideation phase all the way to run these, right? And there are times when these corporates turn around and tell us saying that, okay, what we have innovated together has the potential to become a standalone product. And it's then that, under Nuvio, we pick that up and then start to create it into a standalone product company. And there we use the model called think, build, and scale, right? So the think model is wherein through Ignito, we work with the corporates. And then, once the product is ready, we then build it and then scale it as the model, right? And this we felt, there's a lot of interest in the market because I've been involved with startup village, etc. One disconnect we have seen was that there are a lot of people trying to create products, but many times, especially in the B2B context, somebody would create the product and then look around to say, okay, I have this great product, how do I sell it, right? But the way we are approaching it is saying that through Ignito, we work with the corporate, right? And I'll share some examples wherein once the product is ready, then, when we spin it out under Nuvio, there is a ready product and the first paying customer already available. So we are no more experimenting or looking for the first client or looking for a problem to solve. But it's that a problem is already solved, a ready product is available, and the first paying customer is also available. So that's the Ignito and Nuvio model working together. Moving to the next slide. So the first of the example I want to give this, especially in the TiE context, because a lot of us come from the IT world, it would be very easy to, relate to what we all kind of are used to as a word called digital transformation, right? And the standard way of approaching transformation is like, okay, you need to approach, digital like a big bang, right? Take the whole thing and, I embark on a 1 year, 2 year program to completely transform the organization in a digital way, right? But our model around, using frugal innovation methodology has been to approach it like that of a watermelon, right? So if a company wants to start that journey of becoming transformed digitally, we approach it the way you would approach eating a watermelon, right? You don't take a whole watermelon and just try to eat it, right? You actually cut it into small pieces. And then what look like a very large watermelon, which may not fit in your mouth, you are easily able to, eat it into small pieces, right? So this is an example of the work we did with a large logistics supply chain company in the US, right? So similarly, they've been a legacy company, a lot of paper-based things, legacy software they had, etc. So they came to us and saying that, okay, there is a lot of, noise in the market around digital and how do we become digitally transformed, right? And, there are a lot of large companies who were kind of pitching to them to say, if you spend a few million over 1-2 years, you'll completely change the whole organization to become digitally savvy, right? But the way we approached it was saying that we sat with the leadership team and understood saying that can we kind of as a first piece of introducing digital into the organization, what would be the most high impact area? And after their internal conversation, some initial feedbacks, etc., they came back and said what has been a big area of concern has been the HR area. So how do you manage human resources? And because they are in the logistics supply chain, they had offices across the country, and there are a lot of communication between offices which was happening, which was breaking somewhere either through email, some was through post, etc. Right? So we were then able to take that one area, create a solution, showed them the success, and then we were able to then say, okay, now that you have tasted success within a much smaller budget than what you have spent with a large service provider, how do we then take the next one, and so on and so forth, right? So that is one example of how we had done frugal innovation in the corporate world. Can we go to the next example, please? So in the next slide, you would see that we worked with a large supermarket, right? Now, this again was a very, idea-centric conversation, wherein, within this large group, there are a lot of ideas that are floating around. One in which, they were saying that while there is not a huge amount of business case upfront, there was, a huge interest from the team that was, pursuing this idea, right? So the idea was very simple, especially for supermarket chains. They have these very large warehouses, and these large warehouses then have, cold storage facilities, right? And, the team that does a lot of this maintenance, right? Many times, they are working alone. So they are called lone workers, LONE, lone workers, right? And they have had instances where, these guys would get into some of these cold storage. And then because it's really a low temperature, the body heat can only maintain to a certain level. And because they are working inside this kind of situation alone, they wanted to have a solution such a way that once they go inside, is there a trigger point to say that I'm inside this particular cold storage, I'm going to do this work, it's going to take me about 10 minutes. If I don't come out in 10 minutes, then, please raise an alarm, right? So it was a very simple idea. So, and then we then tried to help them create it onto a mobile solution, wherein, when the lone worker gets into a thing, they send a notification which then automatically triggers and goes to the warehouse manager and also goes to the reporting manager for this particular employee, right? And in 10 minutes, then on the mobile, it will have a ping to say that 10 minutes is up, is everything okay? And if the employee either, switches it off or activates it for another 1 or 2 minutes, an alarm is raised such a way that, uh, the warehouse manager will alert to say, can somebody go check inside the cold storage to see has some accident happened? And if, for example, let's say the warehouse manager didn't see the notification, the reporting manager as a backup is also checking to see if something is there, right? So a very simple idea, came from the team that was not from the tech side at all. But then, taking a very simple idea, bringing, some very limited tech capability to create a solution which became a huge success because, for the team, when they started to use it, it was almost like a case of life-saving solution, right? So suddenly, the whole idea of innovation and doing it frugally became a huge uptake within this organization, right? Moving on to the next example, which is the last example I have in the enterprise world. This is, an example of our work we did with one of the largest airports in UK, right? Where, well, you have these very expensive, fancy, maintenance and repair solutions. One of the, issues or ideas that was floating around was that how do you kind of, create something for many of these low-cost airlines, right? Because as you might be familiar, for a low-cost airline, they kind of make up all their, revenue with quick turnarounds, right? And what internally they have understood was that many times the maintenance, repair, etc. Is actually noted down on a piece of paper or radio, and then once the work is finished is when they then enter into a system, right? So we then worked with the airport and airline to pilot a solution which would help them do all of that in a digital manner, wherein we created something that was available on both the mobile and also on the PC, right? So again, a great example of looking at a burning need of a problem, and then how can we create something to create a solution that makes a huge impact, right? So those are some examples of use of technology in the corporate world. Moving on to the next slide. So what I want to finally leave with this team is that based on this example, so I've given you some examples of frugal innovation in the socio-economic way. People who are not so, don't have access to all this fancy technology. How have they done frugal innovation? How has corporates done innovation in, in an enterprise context? And last but not the least, how have we kind of used technology to help corporates do frugal innovation, right? So this is very much happening around us, right? And hopefully I've given you some examples of what we are doing and continue to do. And some of these success stories should hopefully motivate you, like Pradeep said, in these current scenarios to also try to do more and better with less. So that's my slide. And on the next slide, I've actually put in my details. So if you want to connect with me, etc., my LinkedIn details are there. I think I'm now ready to take any questions.
Thank you, Joseph. A very enlightening presentation. A very relevant subject, as you noted, for the times. Thank you again. I mean, we have a few questions from the audience. So Francis Joseph is asking, frugal innovation in India. I noticed that we compromise on safety and reliability. How we can improve the situation?
Sure. So I think, so I'll just give you a quick context about this, how the book evolved as well. So Jaideep and Navi, when they initially started to do research on how to innovate with low budgets, the very first book they wrote was called Jugaad, right? So it's a North Indian slang of kind of saying that how do you kind of do something that's cheap and easy, right? So it has a negative connotation to say that, many times you try to cut corners, right? And but then because there was elements of good to it as well, is how they wrote the second book, which was around how do you kind of use these principles to come up with something good, right? So if you look at what Mansukhbhai Bhai did, right, the example of Mitti, right, he has not really cut corners. He has created a solution which absolutely solves the problem of a food vendor. So what's the simple need of a food vendor? He needs a solution to keep his food fresh, right? Now, if you can create something that is accessible, not very expensive, right, then you have solved the problem, right? So at no point are we saying that frugal innovation is about cutting corners. It's about, forgetting the security aspect, reliability, etc. I think, people do that, and that's, I think, the wrong way to approach it.
Yeah, thank you. Very pertinent answer. He has an answer. One more question. Which two parts to it. Francis is asking: in Kerala, innovation focus is mostly in IT field. Many other potential areas are neglected, and why? I don't fully agree with it. If you look at the, in particular this TiE group itself, in Kerala is pretty unique. Compared to most charters, this is mostly non-IT. Only few of us are from the IT field. It's a lot of innovation, a lot of activities happening, and a lot of innovative companies here. that's my answer to part of it, but you might want to add to it.
So I think I think my initial association with innovation and startups started with Startup Village, right? So when it happened, I think it was a pioneer in its space, because around 2008, 2009, it was the world was always about India meant IT services, right? There was not so much of a focus on innovation of products, right? And I think what that started as a movement. I think there is some great work happening under the Kerala Startup Mission, right? So I would think that especially in a context within Kerala, I think there are still a lot of good elements happening. But again, I think there is always a lot more one can do.
Yeah, I think one reason why that's the most visible and most probably the easiest thing to do, right? The most visible to a larger number of people. I think that's why probably that impression is there, right? Most of the innovation, because that's probably, yeah. Then Nishant Nambiar had a question for you. Thanks for the presentation. Was keen to know if at all you work with startups from Kerala. If yes, could you share some examples or experiences?
Sure. So yes, I think especially during the time with Startup Village, I've kind of mentored some of them. So I was listed as a mentor, and I still continue to also associate with Kerala Startup Mission, right? So the way we have kind of tried to help them is because many of the people who are involved with Ignito and with Nuvio, most of us have spent all our careers either in the Western markets or outside India, right? So, and our experience has been mostly in B2B. So many times when I get approached to help with B2C, which is, creating the next Uber or, the Hey Auto app, etc., we politely decline, because we say that the consumer side of the thing we are not very clear of, right? But then when you're trying to create something for corporates, anything in the B2B space, we proactively kind of try to see, it's almost giving back to the startup community. So we continue to associate in that. And when time permits, do take a look at, especially the Nuvio website. It's nuivio.com. You will kind of see kind of work we are doing in the startup world.
Sure. Thank you. Jayant Kirloskar had a question. I had this thought crossing my mind also earlier. So thanks to Joseph and TiE Kerala for the interesting presentation. Is there a way to choose frugal over normal innovation? Why not frugal always? Any way to differentiate those?
Right. No, I think, see, and I think the context will maybe answer it. It's like in the Western world, right? The moment you talk about innovation or R&D, right? So the moment you hear the word R&D, you are immediately talking about, okay, I need this expensive lab. I need to have this large team, right? So it was always associated that to do innovation or to do R&D, had to have a large budget, right?
Right.
And that triggered these two professors to kind of start to research and look around for inspiration to say, is there a way to innovate without having a lot of budget, right? And that's where, they chanced upon people like Manshuk Bhai to say that, in essence, Manshuk Bhai didn't have an R&D lab. Manshuk Bhai didn't have an army of people, researching and creating prototypes and, testing out multiple things. He had a burning need, right? He had a huge constraint which was affecting his livelihood, right? Because his, fruit vendors are not buying enough fruits, which was affecting his business, right? So I think, two things here. One is many times I think, people don't approach innovation a frugal way because people do innovation for the sake of innovation, right? And that's why I gave the example of the work we did with the supermarket chain, right? Wherein, some of the employees had a real need. So for the person who was stuck inside a, cold storage, right? He is really worried about his life, right? So it is not about a fancy mobile app or, all the bells and whistles. He just wants a simple solution to ensure that he will be safe when he goes inside that work environment, right? So I think first is, that we need to look for a real solution to solve. And second is, start by assuming that you have very limited resources, right? Because, many times when we work with corporates as well, typically we see that competition is already kind of put in a proposal for, budgets that's like almost 10 times, 20 times what we are suggesting, right? But then we try to approach it by saying that let's assume that there is very limited budget. What can we kind of turn around to show something and then work on it? So that's why if you see on the very first slide, I spoke about, two criteria and how the solution will evolve. One is, yes, there is harsh constraints, right? Second is limited resources. And the solution is built in an improvised manner. It's not like, day one, you just create the solution out of the blue.
Sure. Thank you. Mahesh Khatri had a question. Thanks, Joseph, for the insights. Can you share any instance of frugal innovation in the software development process itself based on your experiences?
Sure. Yeah, I think very, very pertinent question. So I think, there is no direct comparison per se, but, in the software world, most of us are familiar with the terminology called MVP. So how do you really create a minimum viable product, right? So creating that minimum viable product, instead of going through a very long waterfall process, right, has a lot of overlap with, how do you approach frugal innovation, right? And so that's one element to it. But like I said, the way we approach frugal innovation is not by looking at how to use the software, but we first approach it how to solve the problem, right? So for us, the technology or the software use is only a means to an end, right? So for example, the lone worker case study, we didn't first approach by saying, what is the best technology to solve this? Which is the best tool to use here? We first approached and said, what is the real problem, this user has? And then work backward to create something quick and easy. So that's where the software angle came in.
Sure. Thank you. Sudhakaran had a question. Is it a perception that IT costs are prohibitive and hence the need for a frugal approach?
So I think, I think there are two elements to what I'm presenting, right? One is frugal innovation in itself has nothing to do with technology, right? So if you look at Cool, there is, no IT there. In fact, forget about IT, there is no electricity also involved, right? The guy has built something just using clay, right? So first and foremost, I think frugal innovation in itself is a concept that's focused on every walk of life, right? It's just that Ignito as a company has taken these concepts around frugal innovation and brought it to the technology world. And yes, you're right. There is a perception that, the era of mainframes and others, there has been a perception that to do anything around technology is a very expensive proposition, at least in the Western world. So that's where we saw the fitment to bring frugal innovation concepts into the enterprise technology space.
Sure. Those are the questions from the audience so far. So, what would you suggest, in case somebody has an interest in discussing and doing a follow-up, and if you know to need any help, what would
Sure.
you
So I
suggest?
think, yeah, I'm actually very active on LinkedIn. So that's why I shared my LinkedIn profile as well. So feel free to connect with me, send me a message. I'm more than happy to have a chat. And like I said, if the concept of frugal innovation interested you, this book is available on Amazon, right? I don't get any commission to suggest that. It's a book I personally have read and liked it, and that's how I use that. So, feel free to, get a copy of the book and read it as well.
Sure. There's one question came in from Hari Krishnan, which is, I would like to know if you have examples and projects which involve any physical product development.
So I think, the initial examples, everything I gave was physical products, right? So the example of the baby incubator, right? So the first example, wherein there is a very expensive, very fancy baby incubator, which has all the bells and whistles, extremely prohibitive. I think what I heard is, it's at least close to $500,000 US to buy one, right? And the example of another one, which is much, much cheaper, to create a baby blanket warmer, which does about 80% of the purpose of helping a premature baby keep its body warm to survive.
Right. He has he just clarified the question also, which is in addition, which you have done as a firm. As essentially he's asking what Ignito has done, any example on the physical product development.
Right. No, so we are a software space. So if you look at Ignito and Nivio, so we focus only on the software side. So we are only in that space.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So it looks like that is all the questions that today. Thank you again.
Thank you.
And thank you for all the thank you to all the participants for spending their time today with us. And Nirmal, is there anything else that you want to add?
Hello.
Yeah.
There are a couple of more questions in the chat. One is from Anisha. She's checked how do we create an innovative culture action, and any action points on that.
Right. That's a very tricky question if you really ask me, right? There is no simple direct answer to it, right? The way to start the journey is by starting to experiment, starting to do something initially. And I also, like I said, I think there is a huge mindset change that needs to be done. Because typically, like I said, whether you say need to do innovation or R&D, the assumption is always like, okay, where is my lab? Where is my team? How much budgets do I have? If you can turn that mindset on its change, on its head, then I think, a lot of the next level things like, okay, how do you create a pool of ideas? How do you pick up the right ideas to then, nurture? Which are the ones to create a business case? How do you then create something with a limited budget? All of that starts to come in. But I think, the starting problem usually is always that people are stuck with this mindset to say, no, but I already have this lab, but this is not done. I don't have enough budget. So then I think you're stuck there.
Sure. One more question is that products like Miticool, are there any ideas to refine that to the next level commercially?
So that's something I don't know about, because like I said, the initial examples around Miticool and the incubator, etc. These are examples that, the professors had kind of worked closely to understand, right? So again, the idea of creating those or quoting those examples are, because I picked up some India examples, there are enough and more examples from Africa, from rest of Asia. So again, not so much about Miticool itself. There is dime a dozen examples of frugal innovators across the world, right? If you read the book, for example, you will be, astonished by the number of examples of people who are creating these frugal innovations.
Okay. Sure. Thank you, Joseph, and thank you, Pradeep, for coordinating the whole session. I believe the video that I played of Tata Teleservices was without the sound. So probably by the time we break the session, I'll just replay that same video. I'll attempt to play it back. Thank you again, gentlemen, for joining this exciting session. We plan to
Thank
have
you.
the. Thank you for your time again, and very nice presentation. Thank you,
Thank you.
participants. I'll see you again next weekend on Friday with another interesting topic, and look forward to meeting you all again online next week. Thank you, Joseph, and thank you, Pradeep.
Thank you. Thank you, TiE, for
Thank you.
having me.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you. Thank you all.